What's going on, guys? I'm Chris and this is Regular Guy Training. I'm not going to waste a ton of time as far as intros go because I hate it when people do that. So, today we're talking about painting rifles, and in this particular case you can see that this particular paint job is fairly beat up. There's a bunch of stuff added to it. I want it all to more or less match or at least have its own pattern. Over time, use will take a lot of paint off of it anyhow, and that'll actually add to our camouflage pattern, so let's go ahead and talk about that. First things first, we're going to go ahead and tape everything that we don't want paint on up. For instance, one of the reasons why the Warden is on the front end of this gun is to make sure that my muzzle device, which takes surefire suppressors, is covered up. Also, having a super shiny Warden doesn't exactly help and doesn't get anywhere near as hot as suppressors do, so we're going to throw it on. Then we're going to worry about lenses of either the optic or the flashlight. If you have a lamp mounted for night vision and stuff, you want to cover that up too. I don't really like using the bikini straps for these, any of them really, because of the simple fact that they'll leave a lot of times big long lines on the body itself. I usually pull those off and use tape instead. And in this particular example, I'm going to tape up the irons as well because I like having a black presentation. Some people disagree with me and actually really do like the contrast based off of whatever base coat that they use, but that's more of a user preference thing. Next, we're going to go ahead and apply the base coat. In this particular case, because of the type of environment that I'm going to be in, lighter colors are going to help me more as far as a base goes. So, I'm starting with a tan base coat. Now, it's important to note that when you're painting this stuff off, you can see that I'm a little standoffish with it, and I'm not sitting there trying to bathe the rifle, because I'm not trying to protect it from anything with the paint itself. I'm simply covering the outside body of the rifle with paint versus trying to lay on really thick layers of paint. There's a distinct difference. I really don't need really huge chunky coatings of stuff to sort of lap together. And as far as the individual paint used is concerned, I'm using a tan, dark green, and brown from Rust-Oleum that you can get basically anywhere. And as I apply the coatings, I'm going to make sure that I cover basically everything that I can. It doesn't necessarily need to be perfect, but especially black surfaces, I like to cover up as much as possible. Understanding the fact that use will uncover some black things. Now, I understand that there's a lot of people out there that say that nature generally doesn't produce black colors. Yeah, sure, but a lot of places that you're trying to camouflage in are shaded as well. So little black spots here and there on the rifle itself are not going to hurt you. That said, you want to keep an eye on where you apply your base coat and make sure, more or less, that you're not missing huge sections of the rifle. You'll see that I'm covering one complete side, and after a few minutes, or at least enough time to where it's not going to completely come off on your hands if you touch it, turn it around and do the other side. After this, I'm going to give it something like 20-ish minutes or so, just to make sure that whatever paint that I apply over the top of it doesn't try to blend into the base coat. Because if you do that, once you apply all of your other paints to it, it's going to try and gray itself out. None of that actually helps you, and it blends into nothing, so at least for the base coat, give it some time to dry so that further applied paint doesn't mix colors with it. After this, we're going to do the next color, and at least for me, I usually start with the brown. And you'll see me applying this in essentially softer and then harder stripes. Now, a lot of people will see the tiger stripe-y, sorta, kinda pattern developing in this, and a lot of times people will be like, oh, well, I see military camouflage patterns, they're usually some sort of splotch and things like that. The issue I generally have with this is that most nature, especially if you're in grassy areas or if you're in some sort of foliage covered area, a lot of times, a lot of the foliage itself is trying to stand in a upward motion, or at least towards sunlight. This sort of patterns itself in a way that sort of waves or starts to try and point towards the sky. You'll see that me putting the pattern on this rifle more or less follows that upright nature in that, yes, the stripes are in fact there, but they're more or less standing up, so that if the rifle is shouldered and I'm in foliage or grassy areas or something similar in that way, a lot of times it's really similar with other foliage that's trying to find its way towards the sun. You'll see that as I apply the brown, I leave enough space between each individual stripe so that I can apply the green. The green comes in, very similar pattern, and then you'll see that after I apply it on one side, I'll flip the gun over and be sure to apply a very similar type pattern to the other side. Now, some of you may be concerned that the stripes themselves may look a little bit too uniform. Well, the thing about that is as you use the rifle, other things or factors will start to break up the stripey pattern, and a lot of times you'll see different wear patterns in the different spots of the rifle, especially where obviously your hand goes, where your gear tends to scrape up against things, like for instance your body. And that sort of breaks up this pattern even further, to the point where what's covering you makes little dark spots, but then anything that isn't touching you or covering you on a regular basis, meaning scraping up against your body or whatever, is then more or less presented to the world, if that makes sense. So while it may just kind of look like somebody had paint on their fingers and raked it across the rifle a few times, as you start to put different magazines in it, as you start to use the rifle itself, as you start to sling it up and carry it around, different places that are going to look more natural once worn are going to wear. For instance, the pistol grip on this particular rifle is very much rubberized, so it's going to lose this paint really quickly. And a side note is that once you start to use a rifle that you've painted new, you definitely want to use it the first few times with gloves, because certain places, like anything rubberized or whatever that has paint on it, is going to come right off. So in this particular case, while nature likes to break itself up, it does have its own little uniformity in certain cases depending on where you're at. So in this particular case, and with this particular paint job, the wear areas that you're going to get as far as the coatings go are going to break up just enough, but also have just enough nature-like uniformity to look like stuff in the world versus a person with a gun in their hand. Great example of this is the umpteen bajillion videos I've done where I've had very worn looking painted guns in frame, but also you can see things like, for instance, a fairly new paint job that's starting to see some wear, like for instance the gun that I have in front of the camera right now with the ready mag in it. Yeah, I should probably redo this paint job because it started as a desert pattern and I should probably update that. And two, I have new things on it, like for instance the ready mag, but still you can see the difference between one that's brand new and one that is starting to catch some wear. And of course, there certainly is a difference between, this is just right, it looks really good, or, it looks a little too uniform because it's brand new, or, I should probably repaint this because there is entirely too much missing from it, and what's left on it is just sort of defeating the purpose. What's also kind of great about the wear patterns of something like this is, yes, you have exterior stuff, like your environment, your gear, things like that, that will take paint off of what you've applied to the rifle in general. But generally speaking, that only further serves to break you up as far as silhouettes go. Another big part of this, though, is that the heaviest wear on the rifle itself, so grips, stocks, things like that, are attached to you for the most part if you're in a concealed position or trying to hold something down in cover, whatever. Most of the time, it is not the most readily exposed thing. If that is, you're in a defensive position, or if you're trying to hold something down, or if you're in a tactical pause, more or less, depending on what it is that you're doing. Point is that even with the heaviest wear on the gun, generally speaking, it's not going to be the first thing that lets the entire world know that you in fact exist. But that's the cool part about spray paints. As long as you're using flat colors, you can more or less redo whatever paint job you want at any real given moment. Fun fact, even if you apply snow backdrop paint jobs to rifles that were previously done up, for instance, this exact pattern, what's really cool about that is as the whites and grays start to wear off, you'll notice that snow-covered environments are never really totally absent of plant life in general unless you're fighting in the Arctic Circle, which you're not. So paint that wears away from the white type background but then shows up tan or green or a little brown on your rifle now, actually really does help you out in those environments because not everything looks perfectly snow-like unless you're in the middle of a field, in the open, which you shouldn't be. A note also, as far as the snow camouflage is concerned, is instead of going stripy like I did, you want to be a little more splotchy, just kind of how snow likes to sit or get dirty or get moved around by animals, or how it impacts an area in the open versus in tree line versus when it's disturbed by animals or environment itself, whether or not you have high, low in temperatures, whether or not you live in places where you could get snowpack that then gets really wet and dirty, and then you get snowpack again. So a decent all-around-er for that is to be a little more splotchy with it. As far as your grays and some of your extra whites or different shades of white, you want to consider then using, for instance, a sponge, where after you apply your base coat of that, when you start applying your pattern, you more or less soak the backside of a regular dishwashing sponge and then start to splotch your pattern color on top of your base layer. And that's all we really have, guys. It's not that complicated, it's not all that hard, and I really hope that I actually helped you guys out a little bit. So, remember guys, a regular guy's firearm is the last defense against tyranny. Be easy.